one was wounded, Giustiniani, and people panicked. They broke through the walls, and the rest is history. But the fact of the matter was that the war started because the United States was isolationist and let aggression go.
Victor caught some heat in America for his World War II comments, stirring up controversy.
I got criticism for the Second World War by some in America because I made the statement. I think we in America look at the totality of the war and we said we had the largest army, almost as large as the Soviet Union, but of Britain and our allies, our real allies, 12.2 million. And then we produced more goods and services than all of the combatants on both sides put together, more airframe. We look at all of that. Okay, and we fought in every theater and every mode. In the air, under the sea, on ground, or Asia. Okay, we got that.
Victor thinks the war started because the US was all about isolationism and let the aggressors do their thing.
But the fact of the matter was that the war started because the United States was isolationist and let aggression go, and Britain, under Stanley Baldwin in particular, but Neville Chamberlain, appeased people, and the Soviet Union were active collaborators with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That's one thing we got to remember.
Great Britain, bravely, was the very first nation to declare war during that time.
The second is Britain was the first country to declare war it was in the war on the first day, and it was there on the last day. Of the major belligerents on both sides, it was the only country to fight the entire time. It was the only country to fight alone.
They held their ground against Germany and Mussolini, all on their own.
Germany and Mussolini. It was all alone from basically June 20th until the invasion of the Soviet, of 1940 until the invasion.
It's remarkable how the British endured from invasions to the Soviet counterattack.
The Soviet Union. So it was extraordinary. And then when you look at the tank production, the aircraft production.
The manpower of the British Empire surpassed even the formidable Third Reich.
The manpower of the British Empire, including your country, it outpaced the Third Reich. Nobody would believe that today. But you look at the statistics of industrial production, oil, aviation fuel, it was not even close.
These achievements are often underestimated, but their significance remains enormous.
It was an amazing achievement that we sometimes overlook, I think. So I was trying to make that point that Britain really was, of all of the allies, was the most far-seeing, and I think that was exactly right. I was wondering, I've written a lot of books on military history, and I've come across cases where the defeated didn't just become occupied or surrender unconditionally or have change of governments or suffer grievous losses, but they were completely wiped out. And by that I mean it wasn't just their physical space, their populations. Of course, in the ancient world, they enslaved anybody they didn't. But their language, their culture, their civilization, their religion disappeared within a generation. And so for today, we don't know much about Punic culture in North Africa or the Aztecs in Mexico. And did that happen frequently? It didn't happen frequently, but what were the conditions under which it occurred?
He's all into why the Punic culture disappeared, like wondering what happened that made it vanish.
And then I have a long epilogue trying to speculate if that could still happen, given that the agents of biochemical AI are much easier to use than muscular labor of the past. Well, in 335, Alexander the Great, who had just become king on the of his father, Philip II, marched 300 miles southward into occupied Greece. The Macedonians were occupied because Thebes, which at that time was the most iconic city of the 1500 city-states, rebelled. And they thought the new king would either be, or he had claimants to the throne, or he was inexperienced, and what could a 21-year-old do anyway? And he besieged the city.
Everyone knew seven-gated Thebes was this legendary spot with epic defenses.
Seven-gated Thebes was legendary for its bastions. He broke into the city. Everybody in battle that he could, 6,000. He probably 20,000. and he demolished the city down to the foundation, saving only the house of Pindar the poet. And that was the end of Thebes as a distinct subset of Hellenic culture. About 200 years later, the Romans had had enough after a century of fighting the Carthaginians. They had won the First and Second Punic, but they'd always come to terms with it. And so after the second one, they gave them a fine, indemnity payments, occupation. They had certain protocols, all of which the Carthaginians met. But they sent a delegation to see what was going on, and they were shocked that there were 500,000 people in the city. It was wealthier than ever, and it was on the rebound a third time. So the elder Cato, famous for saying Carthage must be destroyed, Carthago delinda est, after every speech, they sent a huge consular army of about 70,000 people right across the Mediterranean at its narrowest point to modern-day Tunisia, Tunis. And after 2 years, they couldn't do much because the walls were the largest in the ancient world at that time, 21 miles. They'd never been broached. But they had a literal genius among the ranks, a lowly officer, a legate named Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the famous Africanus who beat Hannibal. And within about 3 months, he had occupied the city, broke through the walls, had probably about 450,000 people, 50,000, destroyed the walls all the way down to the foundation, plowed the ground, wiped out all of the satellite villages or forced the ones that were still to survive a great tax.
Victor figures the end of Punic culture came when Scipio rolled in and wrecked their walls.
And that was the end of Punic culture, Punic religion, Punic script, Punic government. And within about 50 years, there was no one in North Africa that knew much about this 800-year civilization. And of course, Rome founded a new Carthage about 15 miles away, which is the foundation you can see if you go to Tunisia. And then I tried to look at a different example much later, 1453, Tuesday, May 29th, 1453. Constantinople fell to the Ottomans under the Sultan Mehmet II. He had a huge army of 200,000 people below the walls. But like Carthage, the land walls of Constantinople had never been breached, and they were almost impenetrable if you look at them. The problem was the city was in decline. It had been there for 1,100 years. It was the center of Greek, Christian, Hellenic culture in Asia. At one time, the Byzantine Empire was 20 million people. And they had repulsed all the attacks for 2 months. They didn't think they could break through. Kind of a chance accident with some of their Italian allies. One was wounded, Giustiniani, and people panicked. They broke through the walls, and the rest is history. And that was the end of Byzantine culture in Asia Minor that had been there, as I said, before Byzantium, actually. It had been there Greek culture had been there for 3,000 years.
And in just 30 years, all those Byzantine South Lake towns were totally wiped out, like history erased in a blink.
And within 30 years, all of the Byzantine satellite towns were ethnically cleansed. The Ottomans took over the greatest cathedral in Christendom, Santa Sophia, made it into a mosque. It's now a mosque again. And there was really no Christian Hellenic civilization left. And there isn't really today either. We know that it depends on relegating your tribal affiliations to the general idea of being an American. We are regressing into tribalism. And so we're starting to revert to a pre-civilizational tribalism. I think large swaths of the United States are tribal now.
Victor Davis Hanson insists that we must take lessons about government with utmost seriousness.
Well, I think we should take these lessons very seriously, both from the point of the attacker and the attack, because you mentioned some of the commonalities. At the end of the book, I give you a kind of a common denominator blueprint, and people who have not been defeated or are accustomed to a position of superiority, culturally, militarily, they think that they're invulnerable forever, and they're not aware of
insidious decline. Thebes that Alexander took is not the Thebes of Epaminondas, and yet the walls look as stout as they ever were, and the people are the same, they think. Same thing with Carthage, the same thing with Constantinople. They said nobody's ever going to get through the walls. They tried just early, 50 years earlier, they couldn't do it. We're invulnerable. And people said, well, we're not the same people. They don't think that anybody would ever dream of extinguishing them.
He declares that our civilization is currently at its pinnacle.
This is the pinnacle of our civilization, etc. Constantinople, this is the city of Constantine and Justinian. We can't fall. So there's an unreality. And then they have no idea who they're facing. They have no idea what's in the mind of Cortez. They have no idea.
Do we have any idea what's in the mind of Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin?
We have no idea. We think that Xi thinks, as I think George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, all bipartisan, they all thought that he is so impressed with Western civilization. He's globalizing, he's changed his economy. Yes, he's rough around their edges, but our leisure, our affluence, globalization will acculturate them, and China will hit their place among the family of nations.
Because, of course, they want to be like us.
They want us, and they don't understand that is exactly what the Byzantines said about the Ottomans. That's exactly what people said about Alexander. That's exactly what they said about Carthage.
There's an unreality at play, and understanding the attacker's capabilities is crucial.
And these people don't understand. So whether it's Putin, so when Putin says, I'm going to use weapons if I lose, and there's been about 17 threats from high members of the Russian military, high members of the Russian parliament, such as it is, and Putin himself, tactical even. We say, this is crazy. They would never do that. We never say, well, if I was going to lose and be humiliated, or if I wanted in the breadbasket of the old Soviet Union and ports on the Black Sea and a window right onto Europe, I'd be willing to do a lot of stuff for it. And right. I've done, so there's an unreality, and then on the part of the attacker, they need to understand what the attacker is capable of. I just add one quick thing.
Yep.
I also mentioned the serial threats that China has given Taiwan. And they even made a brief film about Japan if it interfered, calling
the Chinese
communists.
And they've distributed that in China.
Yes, just like Erdogan has said that he was going to send missiles and destroy Athens, he was going to destroy. He said, I'm going to do the same thing to the Armenians, and he just ethnically cleansed 100,000 of them.
Victor asserts that Americans have always been number one.
If we would look at ourselves dispassionately and not say we're Americans, we're always number 10, we would say the following. We've never had, in terms of the percentage of GDP debt or in actual numbers, except for a brief period where $35 trillion we owe, and we are borrowing $1 trillion every 100 days. It's completely unsustainable. We've never had the military admit to us that it is short 40,000 troops, and they don't know where to get them at a time when the American population has never been larger. The Army missed its recruiting goals last year by 10%. Yes. And that was not the first year. And we have had a porous border. We have never had no border at all. It ceased to exist. We've had 10 million people walk across without audit. We've never seen anything like it. We have the largest number of foreign-born residents, both in numbers, 50 million, and in percentages of the resident population, 13, we've ever had, at a time when we haven't lost confidence in the melting pot. Okay. We've had high areas before, high periods. We've never had a period in American history where our elites say that it's a social construct, and you have to let somebody, a violent, out the same day that he's arrested. That's a new theory, critical legal theory. Okay, we're a multiracial society, and we're the only successful multiracial democracy. We know that it depends on relegating your tribal affiliations to the general idea of being an American. We are regressing into tribalism.
He claims that what happened in Afghanistan is unlike anything America has done before.
So when you look at all of these challenges and you look at the symptoms, we have never done anything like Afghanistan. Just completely flee and leave $50 billion in weaponry to an organization that's selling all over the globe. Never had that before. We have never had, since World War II, a Verdun. We have passed the numbers of and wounded in Verdun. We're above 700,000 wounded, missing, or Russians, and we're headed to Somme territory. And nobody has any idea how to stop this. Russia is not going to be able to take all of it, and we are not going to be able to get back the Donbass and Crimea. So it's going to continue. Nobody has an answer. Nobody takes serious that the Chinese would be crazy enough to go across the Taiwanese Strait and try to take that city. They say they can do it. So my point is, never have we been faced with such existential challenges in the post-war period, at a period when we are so weak, or at least we're not naturally weak. Our constitution is there, our natural resources, we lead the world. But when you look at debt, when you look at the border, when you look at our universities, which were the envy of the world, they were the engine that drove American culture and power and technology, and they're in crisis. Science is in crisis. So
we're like the Thebans. We're not the same people.
We're not the same people. We're not the same people that maybe we have it in us. We're not the same people who stormed Omaha Beach when the first 2,000 people were mowed down.
We seem to believe that inaugurating new woke programs is the most important thing.
We think that the most important thing is canceling student debt or inaugurating new woke programs, but it's going to take us 7 years to replace the Javelin anti-tank weapons. We're short 155 millimeter. That was our signature. We were the biggest producer of shells in the world. We're not doomed. We need to learn from wise men like Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, even to an extent Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the rest of them. They all had one thing.
You're not going to mention Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, I'm getting to him.
Oh, all right.
And in a period of doubt where people had questioned their so-called Neanderthal approach to human nature, that they believed that deterrence and not dialogue or the UN kept the peace, along came Ronald Reagan. And he said, he basically said the degree which we are safe is the degree to which we help our friends and tell our enemies to be careful, because we will defend us and we're going to have the capability to do it. Deterrence, 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 which is just a Latin word to scare somebody off from doing something stupid. And if you don't believe in deterrence, then as Vegetus said, if you want peace, prepare for peace.
Victor argues that the concept of citizenship is a relatively recent idea.
The idea of citizenship's pretty recent in the long history of civilization. It appeared somewhere around 700 BC in rural Greece and swept pretty quickly. And so by the 5th century, there were 1,500 city-states. And what it was the first time that citizens were self-governing, and that meant that they were pretty clearly defined. They made up their own militias. They adjudicated the circumstances under which they would go to. They voted for their own officials. And more importantly, they had property rights. They could pass on property. I think that was the catalyst for citizenship, the right of inheritance, that the state couldn't expropriate or own property from the individual. And then that long odyssey brought us to, of course, the founding of the United States, and there were clear distinctions between a resident that happened to live in the United States and a citizen. A citizen alone could vote, a citizen alone could hold office, a citizen alone could leave the boundaries and come back into the United States on his own volition. A citizen alone was eligible for federal services, or in most states, and a citizen served in the military. I don't think any of those still apply, those distinctions between a resident and a citizen, with the exception of holding office, and that's under assault.
I know here in California, people who are not just non-citizens, but here illegally can vote, say, in a Berkeley school board election. And now there's efforts to make sure that people can run for office who are not citizens. Non-citizens serve in the military. Non-citizens actually can go across the border with greater facility than you or I could probably. And so we are a nation, we've never had this before, of 50 million people in the United States that were born in a foreign country of different statuses. Some are legal residents, some are illegal residents, some are citizens. Some are migrants back and forth, and that's the highest in actual numbers and in percentages of the population. And unfortunately, it comes at a time when we, the hosts, have lost confidence in the traditional melting pot of assimilation, integration, intermarriage. And so we're starting to revert to a pre-civilizational tribalism. I think large swaths of the United States are tribal now.
The United States was founded on the principle of equality of opportunity.
Another way of putting it is the United States was based on an idea of equality of opportunity, that because we're not born equal or we have different life experiences, or we inherit or don't inherit, or we're healthy or we're long-lived or not, we don't try to even that out in terms of economic recompense. We just let people follow their own trajectories, and then we have other methods to appeal to their magnanimity. So the philanthropic, the religious, the humanism. We have all these ways that if people do better than other people, we allow them to be creative and to try to give back to the society, or at least use their talents, even if it's profit-minded, to build a better bridge or a dam, rather than the alternate, which is a strain in Western civilization. It starts, actually, the socialist impulse starts with the Greeks. There is a strain of that with the Pythagoreans. But the other idea, and that's what we're, I think, fighting now, is the woke equality of result, that we're going to appoint some Platonic guardians and give them untold power. And in their infinite wisdom, they're going to do two things. They're going to force people to be equal, what they call equity, and they're never going to be subject to the consequences of their own ideology because they need special exemptions given their enormous responsibilities and their talent. And so what we see now is this bi-coastal elite in the United States is starting to mandate behaviors and principles and issues and policies that they themselves would never follow and would have no intention of following. And it's based on that every single person has an innate right to be the same as another person. Or as Aristotle said, once a man in democracy, and he feared this, feels that he's equal in voting with another man, then he feels, by extension, he should be equal in all other aspects of his life. And that was the philosophical worry about democracy, that it always evolved to a more radical form of equality. I think we're now at the end stage where almost everybody feels they have a grievance against the state, and therefore they're entitled to compensatory or reparatory money or land. Here in California, when we were discussing reparations, suddenly people were bidding in the Oakland City Council and suggesting that they were owed $800,000. And they had a grievance, apparently, even though they were 6 generations away from, and maybe 4 from, they were in the 4th generation of the civil rights movement. They had grievances against people who had never had, in California, for example, had never been a state. But it was that mentality. And, a lot of people warned us about this. Tocqueville said the problem that we would face in the United States is that most people innately would rather be poor and equal than all better off, but some more better off than others. And he felt that if that would be a very dangerous development. I think we're pretty much there now.
The question of who polices the police was a major issue for globalists in the 20th century.
One of the problems that globalists or cosmopolitans learned very early in the 20th century during the progressive movement was when you surrender sovereignty to these international bodies, then who is the police? who polices the police? So the League of Nations, which was envisioned under Woodrow Wilson's Versailles agenda, for a very brief time seemed to be successful in adjudicating international disputes of trade or jurisdiction or borders until Adolf Hitler or the Japanese militarist or Joseph Stalin said, I don't need to listen to you. And so World War II doomed the first incarnation of a united group of nations, the League of Nations. After World War II, the same suspicious idea resurfaced with the United Nations. But this time we were going to have a Security Council, and they were going to be the world's top powers, the strongest, the most successful. And then they could be the enforcer. But the problem, of course, was that very early on, the Soviet Union was not the solution to the problem, but it was the problem itself. Because there's always going to be some country who's powerful by breaking the rules and going beyond its own prerogative. In other words, an anti-democratic China that has currently 1.5 million people in camps, and yet they're on the United Nations, and they're a citizen of the world. And if the United Nations would decide that the Chinese, contrary to the UN Charter, are putting people in concentration camps, or they're harvesting from people deemed not necessary, or they're forcing people to have that don't fit their idea of family planning, or they're bullying their neighbors, or they illegally created a base in the Spratly Islands, what is the United Nations going to do? And the answer is they can't do anything. In 2020, we saw an international pandemic, and our United Nations Charter Medical Organization, the World Health Organization, warned us from the very beginning, do not issue a travel ban against China. And then we learned that the World Health Organization was essentially parroting or mimicking what China wanted. And why did they do that? Because of Chinese money and Chinese pressure. This is not an aberration. It's inherent in the idea of global governance that there is always going to be strong powers who have agendas that are not global in scope, but they're national and sovereign. But if all the other countries in the world surrender their sovereignty and one powerful nation doesn't, then they have to come up with a mechanism of collective defense. And so far in the history of man, that's never worked.
Victor contends that big tech media is under democratic control.
All of our, we said earlier, big tech, media, investment, insurance, law are all democratic controlled, and they have global markets now. They adapted best and could adapt best to globalization. And they don't feel anymore that democracy gives them the desired result. They feel that, well, we have an equality of result, quality of opportunity society, and that's what we fought for. Our parents did. We have the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, disability, equality of opportunity ensured, civil rights, but we didn't get what we wanted. What we wanted was a quality of result, mandated, and that's by nature anti-democratic, because if somebody opposes you on the road to utopia, you get rid of them. So now what Michael Bloomberg says, I don't want to cooperate with the Democrats. I want to spend $50 million in Ohio to show everybody that I flipped Ohio, wasted. I want to spend $100 million in Florida to warp that election and show my power. I'm Mark Zuckerberg. I want to tell everybody that I deplatform the president. They don't believe in democracy because they feel that now the businesses and that they operate in are so influential in opinion making or in providing informational services. When I was growing up, to be on the Fortune 400, you had to be worth about 100 million in today's dollars, and now it's 6 or 7 billion probably. They have so much money that they feel that they're sort of like platonic guardian, and they can tell everybody the way the world is going to work at Davos, and this is the way it's going to work, and it's not going to apply to us because we have to be healthy and have jets and estates and compounds and multiple, but it's going to be, we know best for you. And they have nothing but disdain and hatred for the middle class. As one of them once told me when I was arguing with him, you are the guys that have snowmobiles and jet skis, and tell me why you need a snowmobile or a jet ski. That's what he said. They have nothing, they think that the middle class lacks the culture and the sophistication and the taste of the wealthy but it also lacks the romance of the distant poor. So they hate it. They just hate the middle class. They're very dangerous people because they're also not nationalists. So if I meet somebody of this class who's Australian or American or British, they don't believe they're British or Australian or American. They believe that they belong to an international elite. If somebody I meet from Australia is in this group in Sydney, then he feels that he knows New York better than he does a rural town in Australia.